New York, with its colorful lights and multicultural atmosphere, became a new home for 20-year-old Aaliyah. She felt freer here than at home, although she always remembered her roots and her responsibilities to her family. She often visited a small cafe at the intersection of 7th Avenue and 23rd Street, a cozy, modest place where she could drink strong coffee and escape the city noise. It was there that she met Noura, a fragile girl with the same desire for freedom as Aaliyah. Noura was sincere, bright, and had a sparkle in her eyes that drew people to her like a magnet. She worked in a cafe and seemed to be able to find an approach to everyone who came in. Aaliyah first noticed her when Noura accidentally spilled coffee on one of the customers and then apologized so sincerely that even the grumpy man had to smile. As the days passed, they found more and more reasons to talk. Aaliyah would come in after class, order her usual black coffee, and look for Nuru, who was doing her job with ease, but always managed to throw a few words to Aaliyah, awakening a warm feeling in her. One day, when there were almost no people in the cafe, Noura sat down across from Aaliyah. Their eyes crossed, and they felt a silent understanding that they did not have with other people. It was a conversation without words, but with each word they spoke later, their bond grew stronger. "Have you ever wanted to do something completely ridiculous but didn't dare?" asked Noura, breaking the silence. Aaliyah thought about it. Yes, she had always dreamed of something more, of a life without fear and judgment from her family. "Every day," she answered with a light laugh, "but I think I have a better chance of doing that here, far from home." Several months passed, and the friendship between them became deep, almost intimate. They shared their secrets, dreams, fears, and even experiences with each other. For Aaliyah, it was an opportunity to be herself, without looking back at what someone might judge. Noura appreciated the frankness and warmth she received from Aaliyah. One day, when they met on the banks of the Hudson River, watching the sunset, Noura gently took Aaliyah's hand. It was an instant gesture that required no words, but it meant more than any confession. At that moment, an invisible bond was formed between them that exceeded all expectations. They both felt the risk, but it seemed to them that their feelings could survive any danger. Warm days turned into evenings filled with quiet conversations. They spent their time avoiding crowded places, finding comfort in small parks and on benches near the New York City night. Everyone around them was preoccupied with their own problems, and no one seemed to notice them. Aaliyah knew that her father Zakir, a traditional man, would not understand her relationship with Noura. He always had his own opinion about what his daughter's life should look like. Following traditions and values, he dreamed of marrying her off to someone from their circle, with good status and religious beliefs. Aaliyah could not even imagine how he would react when he learned the truth. They continued to build their relationship cautiously, afraid that someone in their circle might find out about their relationship. Every day becomes a challenge. They balance on the edge between secrecy and the desire to be together. Planning to meet away from their friends, they find a small place on the outskirts of the city where they feel safe. However, Zakir, who is interested in his daughter's life, begins to appear more and more often in her life, trying to understand why she seems so distant and anxious. This adds to the tension between Aaliyah and Noura as the fear of their secret being discovered grows. The past few weeks have been a series of emotional roller coasters for Aaliyah. Her feelings for Noura have been growing stronger, and at the same time, her sense of fear has been growing. Fear that they could be exposed, that their happiness, fragile as a paper figure, could crumble under the first pressures of the outside world. After work, Noura often came to a small coffee shop near the campus to talk to Aaliyah about their plans for the future. Their conversations grew deeper, tearing down all the walls between them. They talked about their dreams, about how it would be nice to go somewhere where they could be free from the expectations and pressures of their families. Noura suggested the idea of moving to Canada, hoping that their relationship would be more easily accepted there than here. Aaliyah considered this idea with great caution, leaving everything she knew and heading into the unknown. But her love for Noura made even this step not so impossible. While their plans remained just a fantasy, they still found joy in the brief moments they had together. One evening, Noura invited Aaliyah for a walk to a night park. They were lucky that it was almost empty, and they were able to hold each other's hands without fear of being seen. These were moments of happiness and anxiety at the same time, where their closeness seemed perfect but fragile, like a flower petal in the wind. Meanwhile, Zakir felt that something had changed in his daughter's behavior. Aliyah became withdrawn, her eyes were often absent, and she answered his questions evasively. The father began to suspect that Aliyah was leading a double life. His conservative outlook made any secret suspicious. He was devoted to his faith and could not imagine that his daughter could go against the traditions she had grown up with. Zakir decided to follow her a little more closely, discreetly checking her phone and finding messages that aroused even more suspicion. The messages were mostly short, but they suggested that Aliyah had someone special with whom she was sharing secrets. The more he analyzed, the more his anxiety and desire to find out what was going on grew. Aliyah became more and more aware that her father was beginning to suspect something, but she could not afford to give up communicating with Noura. In order to reassure him, she decided to stay home more often in the evenings and take on more family responsibilities in an effort to demonstrate her commitment to the family. However, this did not help, as Zakir always found reasons to doubt. One day, Zakir noticed that Aliyah had accidentally left her phone at home. He took this opportunity to look through her messages with Noura and found some phrases that he thought might hint at something more than just friendship. The words, "our places," "staying together," and "love" made him very uncomfortable and irritated. He began to look for ways to get in touch with this mysterious Noura without giving himself away. His desire to control his daughter's life began to cross all boundaries, even his own. One evening, when Noura and Aliyah were planning to meet, Noura received an anonymous message warning her to stay away from Aliyah. The message was short and disturbing. "I know who you are and I know about your relationship. Stay away from my daughter." At first, Noura thought it was just a joke, but when she showed the message to Aliyah, she immediately realized who could have sent it. She had no doubt that it was her father because his vigilance had been increasing lately. Aliyah was scared. Her fear of losing Noura to her father's control made her think of running away, but she knew that this escape would be dangerous and difficult. The decision seemed more and more inevitable, but she was afraid to even imagine how her life would change if they decided to take the plunge. Aliyah and Noura discussed the message, and both realized that it was no longer possible to continue hiding the relationship. They had to choose between breaking up or fighting for their happiness and risking persecution. They decided to try to find a way to stay together without provoking Zakir even more, but the situation was getting more complicated every day. Noura changed her work schedule to divert suspicions and appeared more often in public places, demonstrating her employment, and Aliyah began to mention her studies more often to justify her late returns home. But this helped only partially, because Zakir felt that his daughter was hiding something and became even more cautious. He even began to suspect Noura, although he still had only guesses about their relationship. The last straw was the day Zakir met Noura by chance in a supermarket near Aliyah's house. He didn't know her personally, but he intuitively felt that she was the same person mentioned in the messages and whom he had been trying to avoid. Zakir decided to follow her, hoping to find out something useful. He saw Noura enter the cafe where she and Aliyah usually spent their evenings. He watched her through the window as she sat at a table looking at her phone, but he couldn't muster the courage to go inside. The next day, Zakir decided to press Aliyah to try to find out what was really going on. He started asking her questions about her friends and the places she went to. She answered cautiously, trying not to show her excitement, but the more he questioned her, the more nervous she became. She realized that the situation was becoming dangerous, that her father would not stop until he knew the whole truth. Aliyah decides to tell Nouri how close her father has come to exposing their relationship. They meet at their usual place, a coffee shop on the outskirts of the city, where they talk about what to do next. Noura suggests that they disappear for a while, find a way to break the connection with Zakir, and live the life they dreamed of. But Aliyah realizes that this choice will be painful and may cause irreversible consequences for her family. Zakir began to notice that his daughter, Aliyah, was changing. Her behavior was becoming more distant. Her eyes were absent, and she was spending more time away from home. He noticed her staying late after school, frequent walks, and short but warm smiles when she returned home. His suspicions grew stronger after he came across several messages on Aliyah's phone from a friend named Noura. Their correspondence seemed too close, and their words too warm for ordinary friendship. Zakir knew he had to find out who Noura was and why his daughter was spending so much time with her. Soon he began to carefully gather information without giving Aliyah any reason to suspect him. He eavesdropped on her conversations, checked her phone, and tried to figure out her daily schedule to determine when and where she was meeting with Noura. The more he found out, the more he felt that Aliyah was hiding something that could ruin the family's reputation. That night, Aliyah and Noura decided to meet in their favorite place, a small park near the city. The night air was chilly, but Aliyah felt warm with Noura by her side. They sat on a bench, clinging to each other, whispering soft words that comforted and strengthened their bond. "I don't know how much longer I can take this," Aliyah whispered, her voice sounding anxious. "He's always watching me, asking questions. I can't live like this anymore, in fear." Noura gently took Aliyah's hand, looking into her eyes, full of fear and doubt. "You know I will always be with you, Aliyah," she said softly. "We could leave here, start a new life somewhere far away. I've been thinking about it for a long time." Aliyah thought about it. The idea was attractive, but scary at the same time. It would mean cutting off everything from the past, leaving her family, her parents, everything she knew. "Are you ready?" Aliyah asked, not hiding her anxiety. Noura smiled and nodded confidently. "I'm ready. And you?" Aliyah answered with a soft sigh, but her eyes spoke volumes. She knew they had no other choice if they wanted to keep their love alive. They talked for a long time about their plans, sharing their dreams of a new life where their feelings would not be forbidden, where they would not have to hide. The night seemed endless, and they were ready to stay on that bench, lost in their thoughts and embrace. But everything changed when they heard a soft noise in the darkness, not far from them. Aliyah looked around, but saw nothing. "What was that?" she asked, straining her ears. "It's probably just the wind," Noura reassured her, although she felt a wave of anxiety herself. They decided to ignore the noise and continued to discuss their plans for the future. Soon, however, Aliyah realized that it was getting late and they had to go back. They exchanged a farewell glance and agreed to meet the next day to finalize their escape plans. "Take care," Noura whispered, hugging her before saying goodbye. "You too," Aliyah replied, feeling warm and anxious at the same time. The next morning, a terrible call broke the silence of the city. The police had received a report of a young woman's body found in a park. It was Noura. Her face was calm, as if she was still asleep, but life had already left her body. The police arrived at the scene, examining every detail. The body was found near the place where the girls usually met. There were no signs of a struggle, but everything pointed to the fact that it was not an accident. The circumstances looked suspicious, and every little thing could be the key to solving this brutal crime. "This doesn't look like a simple murder," one of the detectives said as he studied the footprints on the ground around the body. Someone knew where she was going to be, and maybe they tracked her down on purpose. A shadow of anxiety appeared on the faces of the police officers. They knew that they were now facing a thorough investigation that would require attention to every small detail that could shed light on who committed this terrible crime. The news of Noura's death quickly spread through the neighborhood, and it hit everyone who knew her and Aliyah especially hard. For Aliyah, that morning was a nightmare. She had not yet recovered from their nightly conversation when she heard the terrible news. Her world, which was already filled with fear and anxiety, now fell apart. In shock and pain, she could hardly speak. Every memory, every moment spent with Noura was now painfully echoing in her heart. The police launched an investigation immediately after finding Noura's body. Detectives Marcus Hale and Rachel Smith were assigned to the case. They carefully examined the crime scene, looking for any traces or clues that might help determine what happened that night. "We found her in a deserted part of the park," Rachel said, writing down details in her notebook. "It's a place where no one would go for nothing." "Yeah," Marcus replied, looking around the area intently. "It looks like she was killed here for a reason. Maybe she had a meeting here or was lured here. The detectives carefully examined the ground around the body, trying to find traces that might point to who did it. They found several shoe prints on the damp ground, as well as faint footprints leading deeper into the park. It seems that the killer had left the crime scene not long ago, and they could still find important evidence. Meanwhile, Zakir, having learned of Noura's death, remained calm and even distant. He stayed at home, silently watching Alia's reaction. His eyes were cold and opaque, as if they hid all the emotions he was really feeling. Seeing his silent reaction, Alia felt a wave of doubt. Her father had shown no signs of sympathy or concern for Noura's death, even though he had previously made so many claims about their friendship. Zakir silently watched his daughter suffer, but did not express sympathy. He had his own idea of what was happening, and he believed that fate had punished Noura for her influence on his daughter. However, this opinion remained his secret, and he did not share his attitude with Alia in any way. The detectives decided to start by questioning Noura's family and friends to find out if she had any enemies, or if she might have crossed anyone. They knew that in cases like this, every detail counts, and so they tried to gather as much information as possible. "We need to talk to her friends," Rachel suggested. "Maybe some of them knew more about her personal life than others." "I've already contacted her co-workers at the cafe," said Marcus. "They say she was always friendly and outgoing, never had any conflicts." "But that doesn't mean there weren't secrets," said Rachel, looking out the window. The next day, the detectives visited Alia, who was still reeling from the loss. She looked tired and broken. Her eyes, red with tears, stared into the void, and she seemed almost unresponsive to what was happening around her. "Alia, we're here to help find whoever did this," Rachel said softly, sitting down next to her. Alia nodded, unable to say a word. "Do you remember what happened the night you last saw her?" asked Marcus, trying to keep his tone neutral. "We met in the park. We talked about our plans, about the future." Her voice trembled. She was so happy. "We dreamed of finding a place where we wouldn't be judged." Rachel nodded, listening intently. "You were talking about running away?" she asked. Alia thought for a moment, but realized there was no point in hiding anything. "Yes, we talked about it, but I never thought it would lead to this." Rachel and Marcus looked at each other. This was an important fact. Plans to escape could arouse suspicion, especially if someone found out about them and was against them. The next person the detectives decided to talk to was Zakir. They were interested in how he treated his daughter's friend. Zakir met the detectives at his doorstep, showing a minimum of emotion. His manner was reserved, almost indifferent. "Did you know that Noura and Alia were close?" Marcus began the conversation. "Yes, I knew they were in touch," Zakir replied in a cold tone, "but I did not approve of their friendship." "Why?" Rachel asked, looking at him intently. "She had an influence on my daughter, and I wasn't sure it was the right influence." Marcus stared at Zakir intently. "You thought that Noura might have changed your daughter?" Zakir was silent, and then nodded slightly. "Yes, I always wanted Alia to be true to her roots. And Noura, she was too free-spirited." The detectives noted that his tone and attitude were unfriendly, but it was not enough to draw any conclusions. The investigation continued, and the more the detectives talked to different people, the more they learned about the hidden aspects of Noura's life. It turned out that she had a difficult relationship with some of her acquaintances, and although she seemed friendly at first glance, sometimes her progressiveness and frankness caused irritation. They also found that Noura often received anonymous threatening messages. She usually deleted these messages without paying attention to them, but one of her friends recalled seeing Noura get nervous about them. This could have been an important piece of evidence indicating that she was indeed under someone's surveillance, and possibly being followed. The detectives returned to the crime scene once again, looking at every detail, every little thing that could tell them anything about the killer's identity. They find tracks leading to a wooded area near the park. The trail leads them to a small clearing where they find an object that looks like a piece of jewelry or a piece of clothing. They keep this item as possible evidence. Although the trail was faint, it was the only thing they had left. The next few days were a real challenge for Alia. She was not only dealing with the loss of Noura, but but also with the constant feeling that her life had changed forever. The police were investigating, and she knew that every day the detectives were getting closer to an answer, but she had no idea who was capable of such a cruel act. Her thoughts were clouded by fear and doubts that haunted her. Detectives Marcus Hale and Rachel Smith continued to delve into the details of Noura's life, gathering information about her relationships, friends, and even indirect connections. The case was complicated by the fact that Noura was quite reserved in her personal beliefs and did not have major conflicts with others. But after a series of conversations with various people, it became clear that some of her acquaintances saw her behavior as a threat to the traditions they cherished. The detectives paid special attention to one important element: anonymous threatening messages that Noura received from time to time. Although she usually did not pay attention to them, one of her friends recalled seeing Noura reading such messages in a cafe in frustration. The messages included words like, "You should stay away," "Your influence is a disgrace," and several times mentioned that she would ruin someone important. This suggested that someone saw her freedom of expression as a threat that could not be forgiven. Marcus and Rachel decided to trace all possible sources of the messages and contact the telecommunications company to see if they could identify the author of the threats. This could help to find out who disapproved of her lifestyle so much that they were willing to threaten her. Aaliyah, meanwhile, lived under Zakir's constant control. His scrutinizing glances, silent disdain, and sharp decline in interest in her pain caused her a deep sense of unease. She couldn't shake the thought that her father knew more than he was letting on. He might even have guessed about her and Noura's true relationship, and this made her subtly afraid of his possible reaction. One evening, Aaliyah decided to ask her father about his attitude towards Noura's death. "Dad, you know that Noura was my close friend," she began, hoping that he would open up at least a little. "But you realize that this is a huge loss for me. She was like a sister." Aaliyah continued, looking for sympathy in his eyes. Zakir gave her a cold look that hurt her. "Aaliyah," his voice was low and harsh, "I have always told you that you must be careful with those who do not respect our traditions. And Noura was exactly like that. She had an influence on you that was far from what I would have liked to see." "But she was a good person," Aaliyah whispered, barely holding back her tears. Zakir looked at her with palpable disgust. "You're too young to understand the cost of such mistakes," he said, and without another word, he left the room, leaving Aaliyah alone with her thoughts. The next day, Marcus and Rachel received a report from the telecommunications company. They found out that the anonymous messages came from a number registered to a man named Zakir. This did not mean that Aaliyah's father was the author, but it was enough to make them pay special attention to him. "That's a very interesting detail," Rachel said as she looked over the report. "He could have used that number to keep tabs on Noura. Or it could be someone else in his family who knew about Noura's relationship with Aaliyah," Marcus suggested. This was the reason for another conversation with Zakir. Marcus and Rachel visited him again, asking him a few questions about the messages. "Did you know that Noura had received threats?" asked Marcus. Zakir frowned, as if the question had outraged him. "No, I didn't know about that. And even if I did, I don't see how it affects me. We received information that these messages came from a number registered in your name," she explained. Zakir was silent for a moment, but then sighed. "It's possible that someone in my family could have used my phone. I don't know. But I never wrote those messages, if you want to know my answer." The detectives exchanged glances. The answer was suspicious, but did not yet provide direct evidence of his involvement in the murder. The following days were spent in a detailed analysis of the evidence found and its connection to different people. The police found some additional traces at the crime scene, including a small piece of cloth that did not belong to Nouri. This piece of fabric was bright blue in color, a rare shade that was easy to spot. The detectives decided to compare the found fragment with the clothes of people who could have been at the crime scene on the night of the murder. This gave a chance to get on the trail of the killer if he wore similar clothes. In addition, a faint odor of cologne was detected at the crime scene. Rachel remembered smelling a similar odor when she first met Zakir, but it was too vague to be direct evidence. "We have to consider that it could be a coincidence," Rachel said, thinking about her suspicions. Marcus nodded, but added, Maybe, but I think we're getting closer to something important. Aaliyah comes to the park where Noura's body was found. She stands at the crime scene, not believing that her beloved friend will never return. Aaliyah feels a strong desire to find the truth about what happened that terrible night. She knows that her life will never be the same again. She doesn't notice Rachel approaching her. "I know it's hard," the detective says, touching her shoulder, "but we're going to find who did this." Aaliyah nods silently, her face showing a barely restrained determination. The investigation was approaching its climax, and every new piece of evidence, every small detail was becoming part of the bigger picture. Detectives Marcus and Rachel were diligently putting together puzzles to find out the truth about Noura's death. All the clues they found at the crime scene and collected during interrogations began to converge, leading them to the trail. They didn't know the name of the killer yet, but they felt that the answer was somewhere close. A small blue piece of cloth found at the crime scene became the decisive clue. After a detailed analysis, detectives found that the fabric belonged to a rare model of sports jacket worn by only a few people in the city. A shoe print found nearby matched the size of a shoe that could have been worn by an adult man of average build. The residual smell of cologne also played a role, and although it was a short-lived scent, the detectives came to an important conclusion. It was the same as the one Zakir had used. Marcus and Rachel decided to invite Zakir back for a conversation. They already had enough evidence to put him under suspicion, but they needed a confession to finally solve the case. They knew it would be difficult to close the case without it. Zakir came to the police station looking cool and confident. He seemed to have no doubt that he would be able to avoid any charges. However, the detectives were determined, and they had prepared several important questions that would corner him. "Zakir," Marcus began, looking him in the eye, "we have analyzed the evidence found at the crime scene and have a few questions for you. In particular, about the fabric and odor found near Noura's body. They match your clothes and scent." Zakir remained calm, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, his voice steady. "I wasn't there that night." "Are you sure?" Rachel asked, holding his gaze. "We have evidence that suggests you may have been there, and it wasn't an accident, Zakir. You have to understand that we just want the truth." Zakir thought for a moment, but quickly came to his senses. "The evidence could be wrong. I had nothing to do with that girl's death," he said. "Then explain why we found your shoe prints and a blue cloth that matches your jacket," asked Marcus. "You could help us by telling us why you were there that night." Zakir sighed, and the tension on his face became more visible. He realized that the situation was becoming critical, but he didn't want to give a direct confession. Meanwhile, Aaliyah, who was feeling confused and devastated, suddenly decided to go to the police to find out about the investigation. She wanted to find out who could be so cruel as to take Noura's life. Her heart was filled with pain and anger, and her fear of the truth was mixed with her desire to find justice. When Aaliyah arrived at the police station, she saw her father being interrogated in the witness room. Her vision narrowed and her heart pounded in her chest. Could he have been involved in this? She felt confusion take over, and her world began to turn upside down again. Marcus and Rachel decided to allow Aaliyah to be present during the conversation, believing that her presence might help break Zakir's silence. When she entered the room, Zakir was shocked to see her. "Dad," she began quietly, her voice sounding desperate. "Tell me the truth. I want to know if you had anything to do with Noura's death." Zakir looked at his daughter, and a shadow of emotion flashed across his face that he tried to hide. His hands trembled, and he shook his head slightly. "Aaliyah, you don't understand. I did it to protect you. Noura, she was a bad influence on you, and I couldn't let you ruin your life." Aaliyah covered her mouth with her hands, not believing what she was hearing. She couldn't imagine her own father being capable of such a thing. "That's not defense, Dad," she replied, her voice pained. "That's a crime. You took the person I loved from me." Marcus and Rachel realized, watching this emotional confession, that they now had all the evidence they needed. He may not even have realized that he had said enough to prove his guilt. "Zakir, you have the right to remain silent, but I think you realize that this is the end of it," Marcus said, rising from his seat. "You have the right to a lawyer, but now you are detained on suspicion of murder." Zakir surrendered. He lowered his head and sighed softly, as if the weight of all the years he had lived with limited convictions was now resting on his shoulders with all its force. His life, his relationship with his daughter, his world, had all been destroyed by one rash act. "I just wanted you to stay on the right path, Aaliyah," he whispered. "I did it out of love for you." "It's not love, Dad," she replied. "Love doesn't kill. You took away the person I care about most," she replied, looking him straight in the eye. She left the room, barely able to hold back her tears. She realized that she had lost both Noura and her father at the same time. Her world had collapsed, and only a shadow of what she had known before remained. They understood that justice had been served, but this case left a mark on their lives. They could not remain indifferent to the fact that the lives of two young women were destroyed because of beliefs and prejudices. Zakir's trial lasted several months, and each session caused an increasing public outcry. The case attracted the attention of both local and national media. Society was stunned by the motives of the crime. A father who believed he was acting for the good of his daughter resorted to murder because of his beliefs and desire to control her life. Journalists called the case a tragedy in the name of love and honor, and numerous commentaries and articles discussed the conflict between tradition and modern freedoms. At the first hearing where Zakir was charged, he appeared calm and silent, although his face showed signs of tension. His lawyers tried to defend him, emphasizing that Zakir was acting under the influence of deeply held beliefs that stemmed from his upbringing and traditions. However, the prosecutor emphasized that no beliefs or traditions can justify violence and murder. Detectives Marcus and Rachel took the witness stand and described in detail all the evidence found at the crime scene, as well as the anonymous threatening messages Noura had received. They described how they had collected physical evidence linking Zakir to the crime scene. Their confidence and detailed investigation report made the judge and the jury reflect on the cruelty and ruthlessness of the defendant's actions. The most emotional part of the trial was when Aaliyah took the stand against her own father. Her testimony was full of pain as she recalled not only the loss of Noura, but also her disappointment in the man she once considered a protector and mentor. Her words struck a chord with the jury and everyone in the room. "You have ruined my life," she said to Zakir. Zakir just looked at her silently, without expressing any emotion, and his gaze was blank. It seemed that his own heart had turned to stone. He did not even try to apologize or explain his actions. When the court concluded the hearing and it was time for the verdict, the community held its breath. The verdict was announced a few weeks after the last hearing. Zakir was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The jury unanimously reached this decision, emphasizing that no tradition or belief can justify a murder committed out of hatred and fanatical concern. Public reaction to the verdict was mixed. Many people welcomed the court's decision, emphasizing that justice should be impartial and act in defense of the rights and freedoms of every person. The story of Aaliyah and Noura has become a symbol of the struggle for freedom, the right to make one's own choices, and to refuse control by others. However, there were also those who justified Zakir's actions, believing that his beliefs and traditions were so important to him that he acted in accordance with his moral principles. These comments sparked a wave of outrage and discussion on social media. Many users emphasized that violence disguised as tradition cannot be justified, and that a person has the right to choose his or her own path without being controlled by others. For Aaliyah, the verdict was both a relief and a heavy blow. She understood that justice had been served, but she was devastated and alone. She had to come to terms with the fact that she had lost not only Noura, but also her father, whom she could no longer consider family. Her life had changed dramatically, and she knew that she would face a difficult path of recovery. At the local level, the case sparked discussion in the city's Muslim communities. Religious leaders expressed their sympathy and emphasized the importance of tolerance, stressing the need to support young people who find themselves in cultural conflict between their upbringing and the modern world. They emphasized that no beliefs should justify violence, and that love and respect for one's neighbor should be higher than fanatical ideals. This story will forever remain in the memory of society as an example of how the conflict between tradition and modernity can lead to tragedy. Aaliyah, having experienced the pain of loss, eventually became an activist who advocated for the freedom of personal choice and the right to love, despite beliefs and stereotypes. She tried to help young people who faced similar problems, trying to prevent further tragedies like the one she had to endure. This case has left a deep mark on society and has become a lesson for many. Love and freedom should be higher than hatred and control, and true care should never cross the line into violence.